Hello.
Good morning. We're
Hello.
back for another Books at Lunchtime.
It is.
Who have we got today, Tracy?
We've got Mike Craven, M W Craven. He's here. How exciting.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Mike.
So tell us where are we speaking to you from this morning? You look like you're in your writing room, shed.
Yeah, it looks like a shed. It's actually in my house. It's my office. It's a bit scruffy. We're actually getting it completely renovated in January, but it's it's my sort of little fortress of solitude that allows me to. I can only write in my office. I've tried to write elsewhere, but I'm far too easily distracted. So I need my own little space where I can shut the door.
Yeah, well, don't we all? Now, there's a few things I want to speak to you about this morning, Mike. But first of all, we need our readers to know who they associate your face with. So tell us about your books.
Okay, I write primarily the Poe and Tilly series, which started in 2018 with The Puppet Show. That's the original cover, and it was then rebranded to fall in. That introduces Washington Poe, who's my protagonist, who at the start of the book is suspended because a suspect was killed after a mistake he made. And he gets involved in a serial killer investigation. And when he goes back to work, there's an analyst there called Tilly, who it's her first real job. She went to Oxford when she was 13 and stayed there until she was almost 30. And she has no social skills at all, whereas Poe is gruff and a super grouch. He's been described as, not by me actually, but by others. So they were the original. They shouldn't even be able to talk to each other because they are completely on the opposite end of the intellectual and social spectrum, I suppose. But over the course of a series, quite a strong friendship develops, and also Tilly brings a lot of humor because she doesn't understand social situations and is frequently saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, and she has no embarrassment threshold whatsoever, which is quite a fun thing to write.
I'm going to say that sounds like it would be. So your latest book is in this series is The Curator. Is that right? So can you give us a brief synopsis of where we find ourselves at the beginning of this?
Well, it's Christmas, so that's quite opportune.
Oh, lovely.
It starts with a pair of fingers being found in a secret Santa present inside a mug. There was supposed to be an engagement ring, but when the intended recipient upends it, a couple of severed fingers drop out. There's then a pair of severed fingers found in a font in a church at midnight mass, and then on Boxing Day in the cooked meat counters at a deli. So there's another serial killer, perhaps, and Poe and Tilly, because they work for the National Crime Agency, so they have a national remit rather than a local remit. They're called up to Cumbria again, and the investigation sort of kicks off from there. But about halfway through, it sort of flips on its head because they're contacted by an FBI agent who says that their case is remarkably similar to a much discredited theory over there, that there's a shadowy figure called the Curator who's sort of manipulating things behind the scene. And what they think is a serial killer investigation is anything but, and there's actually a very cunning plot with a very specific goal at the end of it, and it's a bit of a race against time. And actually, not everyone gets out of this story in one piece, so it's quite a fraught ending as well.
Mm.
Sounds like one to read with the lights on.
The Puppet Show dealt with burning people alive, but the Curator is by far the darkest in the series so far. But to counter that, I've ramped up the humour as well to sort of guide people out of the darkness a little bit, and I think it's quite uplifting at the end. But then again, I've got a weird view of the world, so perhaps it's quite depressing. I don't know.
You talk about having that balance in the book, Mike, between the lighter moments and the dark moments. And I'm really interested in your take on the importance of like partnerships, police partnerships in crime novels. So you've got Poe and Bradshaw here, who are maybe at personally odds with each other. But how important is that relationship to your novel? But also, how important are the investigators' relationships in crime novels generally?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and there's a sort of technical reason, I suppose, why a lot of books are partnerships rather than solo investigators, and that's simply because when they are talking to each other, you can explain things to readers as well. You can sort of get exposition in without actually it being too obvious, I suppose. Particularly in my series, when there's something technical, something very technical is happening, which Bradshaw understands, but Poe, being a bit of a Luddite, doesn't understand. So therefore I get to explain to Poe, Tilly gets to explain to Poe what's happening in a much more accessible way, and therefore the readers are given a much more accessible explanation as well. So I think it's a bit of that. I also think there's the conflict in books, and conflict is pretty much what drives all books, whether it's crime books or other genre or literary fiction. So I didn't set out to write a sort of odd couple thing. The first draft, it wasn't anything like that. It was, I only sort of I happened upon this by chance, really, and that was when I by accident found out my protagonist's name, because it originally wasn't called Washington Poe. It was somebody I knew misheard me say Washington Post and said, what's Washington Poe? And I thought, that's my name. But because he's Cumbrian, I couldn't have a Cumbrian called Washington without explaining why. So when I worked out the name's sort of provenance, he became a far darker character, and therefore I had to sort of change Tilly's character as well to sort of counteract that. And it works well. But if I go through some of the my favourite authors, Michael Connelly, being my go-to crime writer, although Bosch appears to work on his own, he doesn't really. He goes through a series of partnerships, and even when it's a sort of solo Bosch story, he invariably is working with somebody at some point, and that's because you need somebody to bounce ideas off. Otherwise, you're all inside the protagonist's head. He's got to have something. I mean, there's even if you go back to Holmes and Watson, that story only worked because Watson got to tell Holmes' story via, however, whichever technique he was using. The 2 or 3 stories that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote from Sherlock Holmes's point of view weren't particularly effective at all. It's strange. It's quite hard to articulate sometimes. It works better, and that's why the American novels work so much, because in America they do have partnerships. That's how the police work over there. They have a partner. Whereas in Cumbria, when there's a murder investigation up here, there's about 250 police officers working on, which is almost a quarter of the force. But you can't write that in a novel. Obviously, that's completely unwieldy.
It's just an interesting thing to think about, because it was just something that came up in conversation. We were speaking to Ellie Griffith a few weeks ago, and one of us, I can't remember who it was, just made a sort of flyaway comment about it. And ever since then, I'm sure Tracy's the same as me. We've both been thinking about, when you read a crime novel, you're not aware of it as a device or a mechanism necessarily until you start to think about it. But it's so extraordinarily important to the plot. So it's interesting to get your explanation for that. It's really interesting. Cumbria, talk to me about. I can see you've got a map behind you. I'm a great believer that lots of things that are wonderful start with a map. So how important is location to the story?
Well, yeah, I sort of, I'm a bit lazy, so I just thought I'll set a book where I live, and I'll talk about the places I've already been to, so I don't necessarily have to go out in my car or get my walking boots on too often. And it sort of worked because Cumbria is an odd county. It's massive. I think it's the 3rd largest in the UK or England certainly, but it's the 3rd least populated. So it's the populations are pretty much around Carlisle and Barrow at the south of the county. And if I drive to Barrow from here, it takes me the best part of 2 hours. So it's a fairly big county. But there's also beautiful, outstanding scenery, like, you know, the Lake District National Parks, and there's lakes, there's mountains, there's fells, there's moors, there's marshland, there's a coast. But there's also heavy industry. You've got the BAE Systems who build the submarines in Barrow. You've got Sellafield, the sort of a nuclear power plant. But you've also got these weird little estates that are that have incredibly high levels of deprivation. And unlike inner city estates, they are all sort of plonked in the countryside. So they become little islands surrounded by beautiful greenery, and they become their own little serfdoms in a way. And sort of whoever's got the biggest baseball bat sort of rules some of these little estates. They're absolutely horrific. And when I was a probation officer, I used to have to go on to these estates and talk to offenders. So for me, the Cumbrian setting it in Cumbria was an obvious choice. But from a commercial point of view, a lot of people who have been to the Lake District, it's sort of a national treasure. So everyone can sort of feel part of it. A lot of people have been to the places I talk to, because I always use, unless I'm being nasty about somewhere, I'll always use a real location, because why wouldn't you? It means I don't have to invent something then, so I can have a lie down instead. So yeah, so I mean, and it's a nice way. And Poe lives on an isolated, more a particularly sort of unsexy part of the county, and he renovated a 200-year-old shepherd's croft, and he lives there in a one room. He has one room downstairs, and he has his bedroom upstairs, and he has to have a generator for power and things like that, which to me was a sort of nice metaphor for the sort of broody, sort of grumpy, misanthropic person that he is. But I occasionally do have to go out of the county. And the fifth book, the one I've just submitted, the Botanist, most of the action takes place in London as it happens. So I am moving out of Cumbria. I originally wanted to set a national series, but when my contract came through, it said for a series set in Cumbria. So I've got to invent a reason for them to be in Cumbria at the start of every book. It's getting a bit silly now.
Well, it keeps the old brain cells going, doesn't it?
It does.
And as you say, Cumbria is, so many of us associate it with, you know, that whole Windermere thing that, you know, you see on the BBC nature documentaries, that, you know, it's easy to forget that it is, you know, such a diverse county, as you say. Can I just ask you about your past life? Because you were a probation officer. Now, I guess that gives you an interesting perspective to writing crime generally. How's it helped you?
Because I sort of I was 16 years in probation, and I did 5 years as a probation officer, then 4 as a senior probation officer, then I managed the hostel, then I gradually went up through the ranks until I was a chief officer. And I suppose what the most basic thing is, probation officers, a lot of people don't know this, but probation officers spend more time doing face-to-face interviews with criminals, or offenders we call them, than any other profession that there is. Police officers don't, solicitors don't, prison officers possibly, but they're not engaged in direct face-to-face conversations trying to find out how they think, which is a large part of what probation officers do, is finding out why an offence happened so they can actually work on ways to stop it happening again. But I suppose because I write sort of serial killers and outlandish plots and over the top, I mean, there's a psychopathic celebrity chef in Black Summer, the second book. So these aren't the type of offenders I was dealing with when I was a probation officer. I mean, the type of people I was dealing with had stolen a bicycle or beat up the girlfriend, or just low-level, monotonous unpleasantness, really. But as I went through the ranks, I was going to more interesting meetings for because by then I knew I wanted to write anyway. So I got to work out I got to see how the county worked at a sort of agency level, which agencies didn't get on, where the sort of funding arguments were. I got to sit on the counter-terrorism board, all these things, which were all quite interesting to me. And people thought, well, he must be keen, he's making loads of notes, but really I was writing down things I could put in books later on. So I mean, that for me was it. And also, I mean, from a commercial point of view, when I was just starting out, when my first book was, I was trying to get my first book published, it made sense for me to say I was a probation officer writing crime, because it was a hook for a publisher. If you're a surgeon, you wouldn't write a book about a lawyer, you would write a book about a surgeon, because nobody wants to write a book about a lawyer written by a surgeon. They want to read about what it's like to be a surgeon. But I never, not for 1 minute did I think of doing a book about probation for some reason. And other writers are doing it, and they're doing it quite well, but I didn't want to do that.
Maybe a little bit too close to home. Because
it's just the offenders that we dealt with all just done nasty things. I mean, there was, and also I was a bit worried I'd fall into the sort of trap of just actually writing down something that had happened and just changing the names, which would have been lazy and probably not the right thing to do. Anyway, I sort of did that with a short story, which isn't available now actually, about fabricated illness, which is better known by Munchausen by proxy or whatever. And we had a case of that in Cumbria. A woman had, I can't remember, because I was a manager by then, so I was managing the probation officer's manager, but she had murdered her son in effect. But she, so I sort of took that as the start of an idea, and I used it in a short story. But that's probably the only time I've actually used an actual case.
We actually spoke to Sophie Hannah a few days ago.
All right, yes.
And she was talking about the characters in some of her, because she writes all over the shop literally, but in her crime novels, that actually we like to think that the people we live and work around are quite normal, decent people, but when you look more closely, they usually aren't. And I think I'm going to carry on thinking that the people around me are good and decent, but you have immersed yourself in a life where you saw an awful lot of the dark side, a disproportionate amount. What do you think? Are we essentially decent, or are we just telling ourselves that we are?
No, I mean, particularly when I worked at the hostel, because it's called an approved premises, and that is for people who are coming out of prison, but they're too dangerous to be released directly back into the community. So predominantly they are murderers, or we had a couple of terrorists in there. So, people who've done like serious assaults, a lot of domestic violence, a lot of just general violence. And you can get that sort of jaded view that humanity's just really not worth saving, and we should just let a pandemic wipe us all out, apart from people who read books, obviously. But then when you step out and then you get away and you sort of shake it off, and you realize most people I would sort of tell a story about whatever at work, and then it would be interesting to see that people would be appalled by the type of things that I was telling them, which was quite reassuring, that that type of darkness just hadn't touched most people's world, which was quite nice. So I think most people are fundamentally decent, and they want to do the right thing. And I think a lot of the criminals that we worked with some of them were just in situations and they didn't have the social tools to make the right decision at the time. So they made the only decision that was available to them with their limited. I mean, one of the programs that we run, one of the offending behaviour programs, was designed to give them better tools so that in the future they could they had a wider range of options open for them when similar situations present themselves. So I think fundamentally we are all nice, but that doesn't mean you can leave your door unlocked.
No, and I suppose that, sorry, I suppose it's a bit like, why is the news always so grim? Well, because it's news. If we said actually someone holds the door open for someone committed a random act of kindness, that's not news, because that's normal.
No, it's absolutely not. And you can get a bit desensitized, particularly this year when it's just been a succession of terrible things. I mean, it just felt like we were being tested at one point. When you had the pandemic, you had Australia was on fire, you had Donald Trump doing his things and then refusing to concede, and all these like
Black Lives Matter.
all this stuff was going on, but ultimately next year it'll be better, hopefully. Well, we'd like to think so. I can't see how it could be possibly worse. But throughout all, I mean, there's been I mean, you've like flashes of humanity coming through. Like Captain Tom would be an excellent example of something, a really uplifting story of just a decent person doing a decent thing and capturing the public's imagination, that type of thing. All the sort of the nurses and doctors that have been going completely over the top and sort of not over the top, sorry, given everything they've got to make sure that as many of us are as safe as possible. So you do see that the other side of human nature when all this darkness is happening. But I don't want to write about that. I want to write about the darkness.
That's really interesting though, because I think that, you know, the experiences that you've had in previous jobs, you know, they're not replicated in your books. It's a lens with which you write. And I think that what's been interesting from a book selling point of view this year is we've seen people go for either kind of real gentle books that are very like, you know, a warm hug, or, you know, we get people who wanting to read crime novels of, you know, varying degrees from, you know, like, you know, soft Agatha Christie crime right up through to stuff which is much darker and Scandi and much, you know, more realistic. And people find immense comfort in both of those genres.
Yeah.
And I think that what's been really interesting is when we started our conversation the other day on Twitter, Mike, and I said, well, what are you reading at the moment? I was interested in the book choices that you'd sent me. So you've been reading all kinds of stuff this year. So what's been helping you through from a literary point of view?
I have always had an eclectic taste when I've read. For me, it's always about the only thing I look for is the story. I mean, that's what I'm invested in. So whichever world that happens to take place in, I'm not really that bothered. So whether it's a crime world, whether it's a fantasy world, whether it's science fiction, I'm not really that bothered. So I'll listen to people's recommendations and I'll take it from there. I don't think my reading habits have particularly changed, other than I've read more this year because I've had a little bit more time. I've been writing full time, and I've actually done more writing this year because I've written 5 short stories and a novella, as well as the sort of my contracted book. But to counter that, all the festivals have been cancelled. There was no holidays or anything. We were lucky to get away to Madrid at the start of the year because I had a promotional tour because the puppet show was out in Spanish. But other than that, we haven't really been away at all, like most people haven't. So my reading, it was funny actually, because my agent, who is very clear on his thing, he doesn't want stories about a pandemic. That's on his. He's changed his the submission criteria. He doesn't want that. But on the flip side of that, the film Contagion was like the highest rated film on Netflix for a while, wasn't it? Which is about a global pandemic. And we watched it again. And it was quite interesting actually to watch it because they were talking about R numbers and all these things, these like terms that nobody ever heard of last year, but now very familiar with. So I don't know. I'm just glad that people have discovered reading again. A lot of people are picking up books for the first time, and sales, Hachette, which is the Little Brown's parent company, obviously, has reported a good strong year. Sales are up, which is absolutely, and audio books as well. I mean, right across the board, sales are up. But my independent bookshop, even when they were in lockdown, they were still selling books. And I think what this is actually, it's forced some of these smaller shops to do, smaller businesses, and I'm not just talking about bookshops, is to sort of take their online presence more seriously, which is excellent news, really, because the reasons that Amazon and the other giants dominate is because their online platform is so easy to use. If my independent shop was as easy to use as Amazon, I would never have to leave the house, to be honest. I mean, I would just be sitting at home clicking books and getting Lucy to drop them off. So yeah, so I mean, there has been good things coming out this year, but my reading habits haven't changed. I really don't know why some people have gone straight for the dark stuff. I don't know. I think for crime fiction, there's always a sort of a resolution at the end of crime fiction. I mean, I think that's one of the selling points for crime fiction, and you don't always get that sort of justice in the real world. And this year particularly, you do feel as though you need a few happy endings, which might be a reason. I don't know. What's your reading? Has your reading changed this year? Your reading habits?
I'm like you. I've just read a lot more. I think I've just become aware also that there's just such a breadth of publishers out there, as well as just books. Yeah. So it's just been really fun to have conversations like the one we're having now, and people go, oh, you know what, we've read this book and it's amazing, and I'll go off and find it, and you sort of escape into your own sort of bibliography.
Yeah.
And that's a really lovely thing, and I think that's why bookshops have just been so valuable throughout this whole experience, because it facilitates that kind of conversation. What have you found, Tracy?
I have the book selling life has been tricky this year, actually, and I will say that most bookshops will do their very best to bring the books to your door or get them to your door, so that you don't have to resort to any evil empire ever online. And another thing, I'm just trying to keep up with what's new so I can recommend books to customers. I have read some experimental stuff. I read Mrs. Death, which is coming out next year, which is kind of poetry, kind of historical, very much about mental health. And I read some of the books that you recommended. Just my reading taste is kind of right across the bookshop, so I can't say that it's changed any. I don't really feel like I have the option to read just what I want to very often, I'm afraid. I want to be able to keep up with the customers. Tell us about this one.
Yes, Camino Island. Well, I'm reading the sequel, Camino Winds, at the minute, but Camino Island, and it's the only John Grisham book I've got that he's signed, which is pretty cool. It's a book set on this fictional island off Florida, and the guy, Bruce, I can't remember his surname off the top of my head, is a bookshop owner. And the first book, Camino Island, he's sort of a shady, he owns a really good bookshop, and they do author events, and there's a lot of inside knowledge. So he talks about proofs, and he talks about editorial and dealing with agents and publishers and things like all these really quite interesting bits of insider information. But he also deals with sort of stolen books, stolen rare books. He dabbles in that market, and he gets offered some, I think it's Hemingway books, some stolen ones from an American university. And there's the insurance company sends a author undercover on the island to sort of ingratiate herself with Bruce. And it's for a John Grisham book, it's actually quite a light story, but it's a lot of fun. It really is. It's completely different to his legal stuff. There's no courtroom stuff at all. There's no lawyers involved in any great way. The protagonist is a bookshop owner and an author, and it's their sort of like dance, as they both know the other one. They sort of both know what the other one's doing, but they're refusing to acknowledge it, and then a friendship comes up. And the sequel's equally as good. The sequel, there's a storm has hit the island, and one of Bruce's author friends doesn't make it through the storm. Has he been murdered? Has he not been murdered? That type of thing. Really cool. So if you're a John Grisham fan and you haven't read Camino Island, I would absolutely recommend you give it a go. But it's different, but it's written by John Grisham, so you know it's going to be a good book.
Oh,
Here we go. I didn't know that that's what that was about. We've had this and the sequel in, and he really knows how to write, doesn't he? He writes sort of 1 or 2 books a year, and they're always on the edge of your seat, page turners. You know what you're going to get. But it's been interesting because in the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of books come through about life in a bookshop, and it might be a Paris bookshop, and it might be a romance, and so on. But we've had this now I know is about not just about life in a bookshop, but sort of the shady side, the criminal side, which is a spin on that. And then there was another book that has just been published in the UK for the first time. That's been out in the US for a while, called The Forgers, which is a similar idea. Yes, that's the one. Thank you. So that's been out for a while in the US, and we've the sequel is now published as well, apparently. And I don't think it's giving anything away to say that it's about a man who finds old manuscripts so that he can say that he's found, for instance, a letter from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle saying he's proposing to write a character called Holmes, and he gets the right inks and he gets the right papers and so on. And all of the people who are doing this are trying to hide their involvement from all the others. And it ends in it's pretty gory, actually. So shady side of book selling. We don't have that kind of excitement around here, I'm afraid.
And I have to say, this has one of the best, most kind of gross but totally compelling first lines of a book, which is, they never found his hands. So...
Yes, absolutely. Which reminded me when you said about the fingers.
Yeah,
So that's really interesting that we've got shady booksellers. I'm afraid that the most exciting thing that happens here is we might spill a cup of coffee, which is bad enough. You also said that now I don't think you told us about this one. Can you briefly tell us about this one before we?
Puppet show. It's the plots. It's the first one, and it won the Gold Dagger, which was very nice. It's the first one in the story, so there is a bit of getting to know Poe and Tilly a little bit, but they're soon up in Cumbria because a bunch of old men are being sort of burnt alive in stone circles. And I wrote this story because I lived very, very near a stone circle when I lived in Cockermouth, without realizing it was there. And I had an argument with somebody at work, and he was saying there's loads of stone circles in Cumbria. And I was like, well, there's Castlerig, which is a very famous one near Keswick, and there's Long Meg and her Daughters, which everyone knows because it's one of the biggest in the UK. He said, well, there's actually 63. And I was like absolutely flabbergasted. And there's more stone circles in Cumbria than anywhere else in the UK. Meaning that at some point, Cumbria was sort of in Neolithic times, it was the capital of whatever the country was called. Well, it wouldn't be called anything, would it? So I thought, well, I want to write about stone circles, and some of them are in quite inaccessible places. They're not in the honeypot areas of the Lake District, so that'll be quite interesting to write about. And I thought, well, I'll obviously have to do some murders in there because I want to be a crime. Well, I was already a crime writer by then. That would be my third crime novel, albeit the first in this series. So I did that, and I had quite a cool sort of little resolution, and there was a few shocks at the end. And Poe learns why he's called Washington, and which is why I couldn't tell you before, because it's part of the actual story. So yeah, they go through that, and there's some quite creepy. It's quite a dark book, and but again, there's a lot of humour in it to sort of bring it out. But ultimately, it is a sort of serial killer novel. But at the end, you're gonna feel a bit sort of conflicted about the killer, about whether he was actually justified in what he was doing. And there's some quite interesting conversations went on online about the sort of nature of justice. It was quite interesting to sort of follow and not get involved. Actually, it was just to observe it and just to hear people's different views about what is and what isn't sort of morally right. I'm not saying you should burn people alive, obviously, but
I thought it deserved a bit more of a mention since it did win the Gold Dagger Award, which is quite prestigious, so well done. I'm also really interested in hearing you mention this one, because this is a big old book and it's been popular with people who want to tackle a book that's going to keep them going. So this has how many pages? A good 800 pages.
Yeah, I've not read it yet. It's one of my Christmas reads. It's and I'm not entirely sure what it's about, because
sorry.
It's just that if you go through it, there's no actually, it doesn't tell you what it's about in the actual book. It's not on the back page. It's not on the inside. No. I think there might be dragons in it just purely from the front cover. I had just read the Nevernight Trilogy by J. Kristoff. And there's a huge fantasy fan that I speak to. She's a book blogger, so I know her quite well. And a woman from Ireland called Kate Maloney. And she recommended, I said, have you got any more recommendations like that, Kate? Because I absolutely loved it, the Nevernight. She said, well, The Priory of the Orange Tree. So I bought that, and when you're north, sometimes you don't get as much time to read what you want to read as you would like, because my agent sends me stuff to blurb, and so does my editor, and then you get requests from friends and things, which is good because you get to read some quite cool books way before they're out. So I read a very early version of Stuart Turton's new one, The Devil in the Dark Water, and Craig Russell's new one, and stuff like that, which is nice. But I wanted to read The Priory of the Orange Tree, so I'll be downing tools next Tuesday, which is when my wife finishes work. And as far as I'm concerned, that means I won't be reading any sort of requests for blurbs until the new year. So I'm going to be reading The Priory of the Orange Tree and some of the other books that I mentioned. Michael Connelly's new one, which I usually get for Christmas, actually, because he releases his book around about October, November, and it's an easy win for somebody for a Christmas present. But in May, I was given some book vouchers, and I just wanted to just sort of spend them before the year was up. And I bought a signed copy of Michael Connelly's new one. And he's my, like I said before, he's my go-to crime writer. He's never let me down with a single, but he's just absolutely fantastic. He really is. So anybody who wants a recommendation for a good American crime series, you can't go wrong with any Michael Connelly book.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I think we've got plenty to keep us reading there. Thank you ever so much for joining us. It's been really fascinating hearing about this, about the personal experience with the darker side of humanity, and how it can be restored into hope and a happy ending, or at least an ending that makes us think for a while.
Yeah.
I think any good book needs to do that. Needs to stay with us.
It does. Any book that you instantly forget is probably a book that is forgettable.
Yeah,
it's yeah. You should be thinking about it for a while after you finished it.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's a magazine.
Yeah, I get readers say to me that the characters Poe and Tilly are real, and they think about what they're doing now and things, which I find extraordinary. That's
very high praise.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, it's lovely to hear, but I think, well, I don't know what they're doing now, so therefore they're not doing anything because
they're fiction. Right. Okay. So I really look forward to seeing what you come out with next. I did capture the title of the new book, but The Botanist. So we'll keep
Dead Ground is the new one. Dead Ground. Yeah.
Dead Ground. Okay, we'll keep an eye out for Dead Ground. And when you're out and about and able to visit another remote county on the other side, do come and see us in Norfolk.
Absolutely will.
Thanks very much again for your time.
Mike.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.